Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to talk about drawing in pen and ink using more than one ink color. I'm going to talk in general about what kind of ink combinations tend to work well together, what strategies can be used when working with multiple colors, and then show you 3 of my favorite ink combinations. Let's get started. But before I do, I'd like to tell you that I'm running 2 online workshops. My introductory class, titled The Fundamentals of Crosshatching, the 6 Basic Strokes, which covers the basics of crosshatching and drawing with a pen in general, and the follow-up course, titled Drawing Details and Textures in Pen and Ink, which deals with rendering all kinds of surfaces. Please visit my website, the link to which I'll leave below, for more information. Oh, and don't forget about my channel membership program, which gives you access to a library of long-form tutorials and 2 new classes every single month. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled program. I've done quite a few ink reviews on this channel, where I go on at length about the various properties of an ink, its color, its transparency, how well it flows in the pen, its water resistance, and then give my suggestions on the way that ink can be used to create art. I think this is a useful service, and the plan is to continue doing them, but they neglect a very important consideration, in that many artists, instead of using an ink all by itself, combine it with other media. And while I've done some videos where I combine inks with watercolor and pastels, what I haven't done nearly enough of is to talk about the most common ink pairing, which is to use another ink. First, using more than one ink color has a long tradition behind it, with many old master drawings done in 2 ink colors, black and brown. This begs the question, why? Why would you decide to use more than one ink color, especially when the range of color is so limited? I don't claim to have a definitive answer, but I think it lies in the power of art to suggest things that aren't there. For example, Rembrandt, especially in his later work, could create the impression that one is looking at a perfectly rendered eye, when in fact it was just a series of loose brushstrokes. In a similar vein, Rembrandt was able to create the impression that you were looking at a full range of color, when in fact he was using an extremely limited palette that was almost monochrome. In art, there are many instances where a suggestion is more powerful than something fully realized, which leaves no room for the viewer's imagination. This is what makes drawing with 2 ink colors so powerful. A drawing in a single ink color can be nuanced, especially when an ink color has some color complexity to it. But add a second color and suddenly a whole universe opens up, triggered by an artist's power to suggest what isn't actually there. I'll give you some specific examples later in this video of what I feel are successful ink pairings. But there are so many ways to go about it that it would be valuable to give you a few simple guidelines to follow. The overarching principle in using 2 or more inks is that there has to be a logical order in which the ink colors are used together, something that is consistently applied throughout the drawing. A lack of this overarching order will result in a drawing that looks muddled and sloppy. And as I see it, there are 3 rules that need to be followed in the interest of creating that order. Number 1, you can use the ink pairing to show distinction in value, color, or surface. Choose one or more, but be consistent in how you use it throughout the drawing. Number 2, the degree to which you mix the inks is up to you, from completely separate to fully mixed. Decide on the degree of integration beforehand and be consistent throughout. Number 3, generally one ink should be dominant in the drawing and the other a supporting player. Again, the degree can vary, with the second ink only being used in a few exceptions, like a color accent, or more mixed, but choose the balance beforehand and stick with it. These rules not only make the drawing process easier, but will also result in a drawing that has an underlying structure that a viewer can quickly comprehend and appreciate. This warrants a larger discussion, but while in art, clarity of concept does not have to be a priority, technical clarity should be, and even in the most improvised and chaotic contemporary abstraction, the viewer must see that the artist is in full control and playing by a certain set of technical rules. As far as how to choose ink pairings, there's no simple formula, but generally it's a good idea to choose colors that contrast each other in some way, in either value or color or both. For example, a color that's light can be paired with a color that's dark, a color that's cool with a color that's warm, a color that's saturated with a color that's muted. You can also pair complementary colors, that is to say, on opposite sides of the color wheel, though we'll talk about this later. While I've done drawings with two inks of very similar colors, two kinds of saturated green, for example, it's a harder trick to pull off successfully since it's more difficult to impose a system on how each color can be used. Keep in mind that there's a difference between pleasant, harmonious color choices and powerful color choices. Sometimes colors that feel incongruous or even ugly together can make for very effective combinations. To illustrate this, I always use the example of the paintings of the German expressionist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, whose paintings are full of lurid, jarring color, and yet leave a powerful impression that's hard to shake. Leave the color pleasantries to the interior decorators and choose colors based on their emotional resonance. And of course, one of the best ways to choose ink color combinations is to steal them from other artists. My color choices are often inspired by my favorite drawings and paintings, and there's no reason why we need to be completely original in how we choose our color schemes. With that in mind, in case you'd like to steal color choices from me, here are some of the combinations that I use often. No discussion of ink color pairing would be complete without the most traditional ink couple, black and brown. Until surprisingly recently, these were the only two colors available to the artist, with brown ink made from soot from the burning of wood, and black ink made from soot from the burning of bones. In such drawings, it's best to keep the two inks separate, with brown ink reserved for skin tones and black for the hair, eyebrows, and perhaps the clothing. Brown ink is particularly suitable for figure drawing, where the warm brown color mimics skin tone. But in combination with black, the brown looks even warmer and takes on a glow that it lacks when used by itself. This is the magical thing about working with two colors, that placing one color next to another will affect the appearance of both, effectively creating the illusion that you're seeing a larger palette of colors than you actually are. In my drawing, I'm using two waterproof inks made by Platinum, sepia brown and carbon black. For best results, I think it's a good idea to choose ink colors that are not too far apart in value. If the darker ink is much darker than the lighter one, you won't be able to seamlessly connect your values. I think it's also a good idea to choose a brown that is on the warmer side, which will pleasantly contrast with the cooler color of the black ink. I should also note that the color of the paper is an important factor. Solid black inks, like Platinum Carbon Black, can look very harsh and graphic on pure white paper. Here I'm working in a Talen's art creation sketchbook filled with beige paper, which has the advantage of making the drawing look softer. By the way, in case you're wondering, I'm using two Hongdian M2 pocket pens, which I have reviews of on my channel. Here is the final drawing, which has a very traditional feel to it. But if you're looking for something a bit less traditional, you can choose a more unusual color combination. Here is one of my all-time favorite ink combinations. An orange-brown ink made by Monteverde called Joy, paired with a muddy dark green ink made by J. Herbin called Vert Empire. These two inks are wonderful in themselves, and I've reviewed both in my channel. But they also very fortuitously work together, and happen to match the colors of my two favorite vintage pens, my green Pelikan 140 and my tortoiseshell brown Pelikan 400 NN. Both pens are sturdy piston fillers from the 1950s and have wonderful gold semi-flex nibs, and are great starter pens for anyone looking to enter the rabbit hole that is collecting vintage fountain pens. These two ink colors look absolutely stunning together due to a principle I call skewed primaries. The idea here is that complementary colors, pure green and pure red, for example, look very harsh and simple when paired together. However, if at least one of these colors is skewed in some way, either by shifting its hue, value, or saturation, it can create a pairing that's much more interesting. In this case, the green is skewed darker and less saturated, and the red is skewed by shifting the hue towards orange, desaturating and darkening it. While this formula is not always guaranteed to work, this concept of skewing the colors is a great starting point for choosing an effective ink pairing. On the subject of color choice, I should also introduce this important point. Obvious color choices are often boring. That is to say, colors that can easily be identified on the color wheel, pure red, pure blue, yellow, orange, so on and so forth, are less interesting than colors that are skewed. Often colors that are hard to pinpoint, Some kind of brown, but also orange, kind of green, but also gray, are not only more interesting on their own, but also play better with other colors. In this drawing, we kept the traditional order of doing things by keeping the inks separate, using the warm brown for skin tone and the dark green for darker elements. That leads me to another important point. Color is always less important than value, in that color choices can be arbitrary, but the value decisions you make cannot be. This means that there's no need to obsess over color. So long as the drawing works in black and white, the drawing will be successful, even if the choice of colors are less than ideal. Here is the completed drawing. The next ink pairing is also rooted in tradition in that it takes its inspiration from the 3-crayon technique of working with red, black, and white chalks over toned paper. The interplay of these 3 materials can create a surprising variety of colors and was used by such artists as Peter Paul Rubens. For this ink pairing, we'll be using 2 of my favorite waterproof inks, both made by Diatramentus, their Document Dark Red and their Document Urban Gray. These inks are in one of my favorite pens, the pen BBS 469, which is a double-sided eyedropper pen, which is almost always filled with some kind of black and red ink. I use this pen and this ink pairing to do anatomy studies like this, but it's also great for regular drawings. By the way, while I like pen BBS bodies, I think their nibs are pretty lackluster, so in this pen, both sides are fitted with a number 6 steel Jowo nib. While I often pair this dark red with black ink, such as Noodler's Bulletproof Black or Platinum Carbon Black, I find this gray ink easier to control in the buildup of value, making it feel less graphic and soft. In this drawing, I'm starting off with the gray and doing a drawing as I normally would if I was just working with a single ink color. In ink pairing techniques where the plan is to keep the ink colors separate, a bit of forethought is required, meaning you should plan ahead and think about what parts are done in one ink and what parts are done with the other. However, in this case, where the colors are going to be mixed together, I can just start off with gray and draw without any thought of where I'll be placing the red. In this case, the gray is the dominant color and the red is used mostly to record color information. The reddish blush of the cheeks and lips, the pink of the nipples, the orange glow of the reflected lights in the shadows, so on and so forth. But we can do an entirely different approach and start with the red ink, as I'm doing in this drawing. In this case, the dominant color is red, and the black is used mostly to record distinction in value, placed in areas where the red just doesn't go dark enough, such as the darker core shadows and, of course, the hair. Both ways are equally valid, it's just a question of how you want the drawing to look. And by the way, not to overcomplicate things, but I also enjoy using these 2 inks for ink and wash. Here's an example where I use dark red for line and gray as a supporting wash. It would of course also work in reverse, but I find the dark red lines and the pale gray wash combination very stylish. Here are the 2 completed drawings. The first black dominant with touches of red, and the second red dominant with touches of black. And lastly, let's go a little wild in our ink pairing and not only try some odd saturated colors, but add a third. The ink colors I've chosen are inspired by German Expressionism and are Noodler's Apache Sunset, which is a striking yellow-orange, Noodler's Green Marine, which is just a little more green than turquoise, and Diamine Matador, a color closely approximating alizarin crimson. The color choices here follow that skewed primary principle, in that each one is slightly off, with the yellow leaning towards orange, the green leaning towards blue, and the red leaning purple. However, when making color decisions, don't blindly follow formula. For example, another alizarin crimson-like ink with a very strange name called Black Swan in Australian Roses, which is made by Noodlers, didn't work at all, perhaps because it's way more saturated than the other 2 colors and somehow overpowered them. For this drawing, I'm using 3 platinum preppies. These very inexpensive pens that work much better than they need to for pens at this price point have the advantage that they can be eyedroppered. They're a great way of using a bunch of different ink colors and not losing track of what ink color you have in your pens. For this drawing, I'm integrating the ink colors, which leads to a lot of exciting color complexity. But despite the chaotic color choices, the way I'm using these inks is very logical. The colors are organized by value, with the yellow being used in the lights, red being used in the midtones, and green in the darker values. Here is the completed drawing. I hope this video spurs you to try your hand at pairing ink colors, and if it does, I would love to hear what pairings you come up with. Thank you so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.